Several years ago, I believe Jessica and I were still dating. We were at a mall, and I got to talking with one of the men who was working at a kiosk. I think he had a product that I was interested in or something or another, and somehow he found out that I was a Christian. I'm thinking maybe I might have been at Southwest for my first year during that time. And we got on that discussion. He said, "Well, do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "Why do you believe in God?" And that kind of caught me off guard. I had never had someone in such a bold way ask me that before. I had talked with people about it, but I'd never had someone who, at least from the way he was asking it, it seemed as if he wasn't a believer, asked me in that way, "Why do you believe in a God?" And it caught me so off guard that I stumbled over and really struggled with conveying why I believed in God. And I could tell, at least from my perspective, that he was disappointed in my answer. And I was disappointed in my own answer. I was disappointed in myself. Of course, hindsight's 20/20. Later, you're looking back and say, "Well, I should have said this, I should have said this, I should have said this." But in the end, I wasn't ready for that. And that was on me. It was my fault. And I decided, I think at least subconsciously in my own mind, that I wasn't going to let that happen again. That if someone came to me and asked me, "Why do you believe this?" that I could in some shape, form, or fashion give them a succinct, simple answer as to why I believed what I believe. Now, if someone came to you and asked you a question about your beliefs as a Christian, they found out that you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you're a disciple, and they come and they ask you, "Well, why do you believe?" Same question that young man asked me. Why do you believe in God? Why do you believe that Jesus rose from the grave? Why do you, and if you simply would say, "Well, because the Bible says so," which, by the way, is a valid answer. Some individuals try and make that seem as if it's not a valid answer. That is a valid answer, and we'll talk about that in certain situations. But then if they ask the question, "Well, why do you believe the Bible?" Why do you believe in the Bible? Maybe when you get into religious discussions with individuals who do believe in Jesus Christ but don't adhere to what we teach and practice here, maybe they would ask questions like, "Well, why do you believe that baptism is necessary for salvation? Why do you worship without instruments? Why do you do what you do in the way that you do? Why do you partake of the Lord's Supper every Sunday instead of maybe once every few months or a couple of times a year? What's the reason for that?" Would you feel confident enough and comfortable enough with your beliefs and your convictions about those things to not be able to complicate things, but to give a succinct and simple answer as to why you believe what you believe? Now, I think it's very important for us as Christians, especially as the world is growing increasingly more secular, for us to be able to do that. I think it's extremely important to not only be able to explain it, but to explain it in a simple way where people can understand it. And so as I began thinking about that, I began thinking about subjects that maybe we could discuss. And so tonight we're beginning a series that we'll be going over for the next several Sunday evenings. Probably take a break next Sunday evening because of First Sunday Focus, but then come back the following week. But the title of the series is Reasons to Believe. Reasons to Believe. Now, I planned on having a PowerPoint for you this evening, but then Joshua Ankia came last Sunday night, and the PowerPoint had worked for me really well Sunday morning, and then Sunday night Joshua came, and it just was giving him so many problems, it just terrified me. I was like, well, maybe it just really doesn't like Sunday evening worship. But I have a new remote that's ordered for me on the way, and I'm hoping that will work. So maybe the next time we will have a PowerPoint. And I do plan to use PowerPoint throughout this because I think the visuals and things of that nature will help. But the title of the series is Reasons to Believe. And I hope this study will give you the confidence to answer some of these questions. My hope and my desire is that you could have an index card and put these lessons essentially and the reasons that we're giving on an index card. and that you could quickly and succinctly explain to individuals why you believe, what you believe about these important key Christian doctrines. Now, some of these, for those of you who have grown up in the church, you might feel more comfortable about discussing them than others. Other subjects, maybe not so much. I remember asking when we were doing our apologetics class, our Christian evidence class for the high school several months ago, and we had been talking about how to prove the existence of God. And we talked about several arguments that we'll discuss in this series. And I said, well, then we started discussing the resurrection of Jesus Christ. How do we know that Jesus rose from the grave? And I said, now before this class, how many of you could give me one or two reasons from what we've discussed as to why you think God exists? Now, you might not be able to put it into formal argument style, debate style, but you could say something like, well, design demands a designer, or something like that. And the vast majority of them raised their hands. I said, now let me ask this. I said, how many of you, before this class, if someone came up to you and asked you, why do you believe that Jesus rose from the grave? How many of you could explain to that person why you believe that? Not a single one of them raised their hand. Now, that wasn't on them. I think that's a vast majority of the church. I think many of our adults in here would struggle with that. And in my opinion, I think we've had a tendency to focus on certain arguments for the existence of God and haven't done as good of a job as discussing the resurrection. Although I know John has preached on the resurrection several times here over the years. He has a great lesson that I actually asked him to present at DU last year, I believe. But growing up, I couldn't have told you why I believe that Jesus rose from the grave, except for the Bible tells me so. And again, I think that's a legitimate answer in certain circumstances, and we'll discuss that. But I hope that this study will be beneficial to you tonight. And tonight, I just want us to briefly look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, which is going to be our key verse, our kind of focus verse for the duration of this study. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 is a passage that I think many of you are very familiar with. Peter there says, "But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." Now, this is going to be, again, our key verse, our focus verse here throughout the duration of this study. But what exactly is Peter talking about here? Well, I think that there are three principles from this verse that should kind of guide every single discussion that we have. Every single doctrine, every single topic. Three principles from 1 Peter as we discuss our reasons to believe. And the first principle being that within us there must be a personal reverence for Jesus Christ. A personal reverence. Notice what he says there in verse 15. "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy." Some of your versions translate it as, "But sanctify," right? "The Lord Jesus Christ in your heart." I think the New King James and King James says that. But sanctify, that is, set apart Jesus as holy in your life. Make Jesus the most important thing in your life. Crown Him as King in your life. And the reason being that Peter is saying this is because conviction, which is what we're desiring conviction, true belief in what we are teaching. Conviction comes from crowning Jesus as the Lord of your life. That is the first and necessary step. If you want to truly be a Christian, deep down in your heart, deep down in your soul, if you want to believe what is here, you have to crown Jesus as the Lord of your life. You have to sanctify Him. And I think that this is a daily exercise in which we have to wake up in the morning and we have to say, today, every single day, today, Jesus is the most important thing in my life. Today, I treasure Jesus more than anything or anyone. Peter says, you've got to make Jesus, I like how the ESV translates that, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy. Is Jesus holy and majestic and awesome regardless of whether or not you recognize Him as holy? Yes. Your recognition of Jesus' holiness doesn't make Him more or less holy. So what is Peter saying here? There has to be a personal recognition and reverence in your life that Jesus is who He said He is. That's the first step. A personal recognition and reverence and awe of Jesus Christ. I like how one commentator translated this sanctified aspect. He says, to sanctify Jesus means that we hold as sacred in our innermost being who Jesus is. We hold Him as sacred. It's a confession of Jesus' sovereignty and superiority and sufficiency that seeps into our bones, that goes deep within our soul. It's an inner reality that, and notice that here's the connection here, it's an inner reality that begins to express itself in outward transformation. Because all of a sudden, these individuals who have reverenced Jesus deep within their hearts, people are noticing something different about them. They're noticing something that is different about the way that they live their lives. In fact, he turns over, if you just turn over to chapter 4, turn over to 1 Peter chapter 4, maybe just flip a page. He kind of discusses this in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 4. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. And with respect to this, they are surprised, notice this, when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give an account to Him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. Notice, they recognize that all of a sudden there's something different about you, and they marginalize you. They malign you. They disparage you because of the life that you're living. But what Peter's talking about in 1 Peter, and I think these two things are connected as well, but what he's specifically talking about in 1 Peter chapter 3 is that there is a hope in you. There's a hope in you that they recognize. As you daily make Jesus holy in your life, as you daily make Him your greatest treasure in your life, that, I'm telling you, brethren, the more that you elevate Jesus in your life and the more that you treasure Jesus in your life, the more hope you are going to have in your life. And so he says, the more that you magnify Jesus in your life will be consumed in hope. And people will see that in you. They will see it in you. And that, by the way, is why Paul so vehemently denounces and attacks any doctrine that questions the reality and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. That is why he hates those doctrines. Because if you look at Colossians, for example, the reason Paul is so angry about this heresy that has come into Colossae is because it is questioning the sufficiency of Jesus Christ, and therefore it is questioning the hope of the Christian. And so he says, as you treasure Jesus in your life, there is a hope. Now he talked about this hope in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. He says, we have been born again by the great mercy of God unto a what? A living, a thriving hope. Now there are individuals in this world who have hope in certain things, but then those hopes are dashed. They might have hopes in stocks they bought for a company, for their investment in the future. Maybe they had hopes in a relationship. Maybe they had hopes in a political candidate. And all of a sudden those hopes are gone. Whatever it might be, those are, once they're there and that person disappoints or something doesn't work out, those are dead hopes. But he says the hope of the Christian is a living and thriving hope that consistently flourishes and grows in your life. As you come to really recognize who Jesus is and to love Him and to adore Him more, it is a substantive hope. Now notice, it is a hope that is in the midst of trouble and fear. Notice verse 14 of 1 Peter 3. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. Now, you don't say to someone, don't be afraid, don't be troubled, unless they're really fearful and really troubled. If I came up to you just randomly and you're laughing and talking and I said, hey, don't be afraid, don't be troubled, you look at me like I'm crazy. What are you talking? I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. What are you talking? Peter's addressing an issue that they're going through here. They are afraid and they are troubled. And he said, the hope that you have in Jesus Christ is enduring through troublesome, difficult times. And people recognize that. When everybody else is losing their minds because the stock market has crashed, or because the economy isn't good, or because there's a war going on over here, whatever it is, everybody else has lost hope. He says all of a sudden, during these difficult times, people begin to recognize these little lights that are walking around. Why are they so peaceful? Why are they filled with so much hope? Maybe that's an indictment upon us if people aren't asking us why we have hope. I'll tell you, sometimes there's nothing more discouraging than watching Christians during a political season, because we act as if our hope ultimately lies within men. There's nothing wrong with being involved in politics. There's nothing wrong with voting. I don't think that you can say scripturally that there's anything wrong with that. I think it can be a good thing. But we better be very careful about who we are ultimately placing our hope in, and what people are seeing in us when we're disappointed by individuals. People will see a change in how you live and how you act, and they begin asking what makes them that way, Peter says. And so they ask you why. And so there must be first a personal reverence. Secondly, there must be a prepared defense. A prepared defense. Notice that he says you have to be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. That word defense there, as you might know, is the word apologia. It's where we get our word apologetics from. Now, whenever you hear the word apologetics, that doesn't mean that we go around apologizing to people for being Christians. What it means is that you give a defense. When you hear of Christian apologetics, you're giving a defense of the Christian faith. Now, what's interesting here is that Peter is not saying, okay, I want you to find scholars and send them to schools and make them be the only ones that defend the Christian faith. Now, there's value in that. There is absolute value. I'm so thankful for the brethren who take time to get educated and take the money and the time to do that. I'm so grateful for them. Apologetics Press, all those necessary and absolutely good. But that is not what Peter is talking about here. He is talking about individual, personal Christians, every disciple, being able to give a defense for the reason that is in them. Okay? And I think that you need to realize that is a responsibility that you have as a disciple of Jesus Christ, to be able to defend that and to give explanation for that. Okay? And I think there's three words here that will help us to realize what he's talking about. Number one, the word is always. Notice that he says always being prepared. Always being ready. Peter says don't let your guard down. Don't let there be a moment like what I was discussing at the beginning of this lesson. A moment where you're not ready to explain these things. Always be on guard. Always be ready. The Boy Scouts motto is be prepared. Okay? And I had to check that just to make sure before I left, because I was in the Boy Scouts growing up, but it's been a while, and I'm always afraid that companies or something is going to change their motto, and then you're going to come after me afterwards and say, that's not their motto anymore. But their motto is, as far as I know, is be prepared. And when I was looking this up, I thought it was interesting that there was an explanatory page on this. What does that motto mean? And it says that you are always in a state of readiness in mind and body to do your duty. I think that's a good description of what the Christian life should be. Always prepared in mind and in body to do your duty. And so that is what Peter is saying here. Don't wait. A Christian should be someone who should be able to give a succinct and simple answer, to give an explanation and a reason for the life that they're living. And they shouldn't have to say, well, can you wait for my preacher? Can we schedule a time with my preacher and then he can explain to you why I'm living the way that I'm living? Now, there's nothing wrong. I don't mind helping you out in any way that I can. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm so grateful when I get to meet your friends and talk to them about what we believe and practice here. But ultimately, in some shape, form, or fashion, there's a responsibility upon you as an individual Christian to be able to explain these things to them. Always being ready to give an answer to those. The second one is that to be prepared or to be ready. You know, I think all of us have crammed for a test at some point in our life. Maybe you haven't, but I've had some really late nights where I'm cramming for a test. And I remember a couple of just miserable nights when I was at the Southwest School of Bible Studies trying to cram for a test. And I learned very quickly. Interestingly enough, of course, Catherine's dad, Brother Brumback, was my instructor in Greek. And I enjoyed his classes, but I learned very quickly that one test you cannot cram for is a Greek test. That just does not work out well at all. My mind was not made to cram for Greek exams. That kind of rhymed. I didn't mean that to, but we've all had. But going back to that experience at Southwest, something that Brother Garner would always do to us, and I love him now for it. Didn't love him very much then for it, but was a pop quiz. He would always do these pop quizzes occasionally, and he wouldn't let us. You know, a lot of times now teachers will say, "You're going to have a pop quiz on Friday." Well, it's not a pop quiz. It's just a quiz, right? The pop quiz is that the intention is that it's given by the teacher to make sure that you truly know the material, that you're not just cramming these things in last minute, but that you're fully understanding the material that's being given. And so that's what Peter's saying here. You're not trying to cram for a test right before someone asks you a question. You're ready for those pop quizzes of your faith. You know the material. You know why you believe what you believe, and you're ready to tell them. You might not can go into every single detail, but you can give them a sufficient answer as to why you're living the way that you're living, why you hope in what you hope in, and why there is joy in your life when everybody else is losing their minds. If you value something, you take the time to know it. You take the time to study it. And so are you ready for the pop quiz of your faith? Are you ready for individuals to ask you that? Do you know the material? Do you know why you believe what you believe? And I think that it's important. I will say this. Let me say this. There's a little caveat here. If you are not prepared, if you're not prepared to give an answer, maybe you haven't fully studied that particular subject, it is okay to say, you know what, I don't know that right now. I can't explain it. Would you give me some time to come back to you and talk to you about that? And I say that's okay to say that because the last thing I want you to do is to give an inaccurate answer to them for the reason that, for the hope that's within you. I think it's more important to make sure that you are aware of what you're talking about. The third word under this idea of having a prepared defense is the word defense. Make no mistake about it. You are defending something, which means that someone is attacking something. I think that what Peter is talking about here might be a genuine inquiry from someone who's saying, hey, why are you living the way that you're living? But at the end of the day, he does use the word defense. And it's translated, I think, accurately, defense. Because in some shape, form, or fashion, even honest inquiries can quickly turn to aggressive inquiries. And so, as an individual, there is a defense, an explanation, an apologia. Now, what sometimes I think we don't really recognize in this verse is that he says you need to be able to make a defense for the reason. Okay? He's not saying, he doesn't just simply say you need to make a defense. He says you need to make a defense for the reason. Those are two different things, I think. The reason is what? The reason is Jesus. The reason you have the hope in you is Jesus. But how can you defend that claim? What defense can you make of that reason? The reason is, I have this life and I live this life because Jesus is the sovereign Lord of the universe. He rose from the grave. That's the reason. But why? Why is He that way? And so this implies, I think, again, that at times there will be attack on the reason. The reason, Jesus. That's what the heresies were doing in the first century, is they were attacking the reason. They were attacking the hope of the Christian, which was Jesus. And so Paul had to come back in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, and give an apologia of the resurrection. He had to make a defense because they were attacking the reason. Are you ready for this part of your Christianity? Are you ready for that defense, to make a defense? Because I'm telling you right now, as our world grows increasingly more secular, you're going to have to do that if you haven't already. You're going to have to. And I think it's good. I think it's good that we have to. Sometimes we become a little bit too careless in our thinking, and it forces us to re-examine certain beliefs and make sure that we understand and believe and know them. So there has to be a personal reverence, a prepared defense, and thirdly, the third principle for guiding this discussion is there must be a peaceful explanation. A peaceful explanation. Notice that he says, give a defense. Now that kind of has almost like I said, can have an aggressive tone to it. But then he says, but do it with gentleness and respect. Do it with gentleness and respect. Now I want you to realize that that part of this command is just important as the previous part. Make a defense. That's a command to you, Christian. Do it with gentleness and respect. That's just as much of a command. And if we make a defense, but we do it disrespectfully, we do it harshly, we do it arrogantly, we do it rudely, the Lord will hold you accountable. Because you can easily turn souls away from the gospel. And the deceptive thing is that you can blame it on them. You could say, well, they just don't want to know the truth. No, they might have wanted to know the truth. They just didn't want to see you telling them. And you've turned them away. The manner in which this is done is just as important as the matter being discussed. And some people have been sadly turned away from the gospel and from the church because they've heard arrogant, condescending individuals and attitudes do it. And what I've learned is that, I don't know about you, but people that are convicted about the truth, really convicted about the truth, they don't need to be condescending. In fact, what I've discovered is that it's the individuals who are really struggling with explaining or defending what they believe or really don't believe it. Those are the individuals who all of a sudden start shouting and throwing comments around. Those are those type of individuals. And Christians are not called to be that. I was very impressed by Joshua Ankia last Sunday evening. It was good to have him here. This was the first time that I'd met him. First time I'd heard a presentation that he had given. And I don't know if you noticed, but he was talking about some pretty aggressive situations that he had gotten into over the years. And whenever he was even talking about it or relaying how he addressed that, it was always done in gentleness and respect. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but he was very calm and gentle in how he responded to them, and he just has that spirit about them. Now, there's individuals who can naturally do that, okay? I believe that. Their temperament is better. It just automatically comes easier to them to be more gentle and respectful. And then there are those of us who don't find that easy to do. And I'm one of those people, I'll admit that. I've struggled with that over the years, and the Lord's had to work on me in that. We have to recognize our limitations, that we might have a tendency to become more aggressive more quickly in our defense of truth. And we have to be mindful of that. So, but power in God's people, there is power in God's people speaking truth in a loving way. Ephesians 4 and verse 15, to speak the truth in love. And so you must have a personal reverence for Jesus Christ in your life if you're going to give a reason for what you believe. A prepared defense and a peaceful explanation. We're commanded to love God with all of our hearts, with all of our souls, and with all of our what? Our minds, our strength. And I think that having to really examine your faith, really think through and analyze why you believe what you believe about various Christian doctrines is a way in which you love God with your mind. Now, you might be sitting here this evening thinking, well, I do love God, but that doesn't necessarily mean I need to think through these things as you're talking about. Well, you might love God with all of your heart and with all of your soul, but do you love Him with all of your mind? Are you using your intellect in service to the Lord? Do you love Him with that part of you? And are you willing and ready to give a reason for what you believe? Looking forward to the study on Sunday evening, and I hope that you are too. If you have any need to respond to the gospel, for prayers, for encouragement, whatever your need is, why don't you come forward as we stand and as we sing.